another episode of Bernie Speaks to the Community. And I'm Lauren-Glenn Davitian, and I'm here to talk to the mayor about some of the issues that are coming up within the next year and the next week and the next month.
Another episode, Lauren? I've not heard of that expression. This is city government at work here.
Television. Okay, so you've got a lot on your mind here.
We do. It's a busy time, but before we begin the program, I want to wish all of our viewers a very happy holiday season and a healthy and prosperous new year. I think the first issue that I would like to discuss is what is probably the most important series of events that are going to be happening in the state within the next few months, and that is the convening of the Vermont State Legislature and a development of an agenda on the part of the legislature. One of the things that never ceases to amaze me is the lack of direction, firm direction, that exists in the legislature. Sometimes you have the feeling that when the legislature convenes, you have 180 legislators, each one running in their own different direction, rather than sitting down and say, okay, while there are thousands of real details that have to be dealt with, there are a dozen major areas that we have got to address, and we are going to address them. A, B, C, D, and E. And let's get going. And very, very rarely do you see that. And that depresses me. I mean, I go down there year after year, and you just see an enormous amount of time being spent on what are not, in fact, the major issues facing the state. So I think one of the roles that the city of Burlington will play is trying to provide some leadership, if you like. I know that sounds a bit presumptuous, but some leadership in determining what are some of the major issues facing the state and, of course, the city of Burlington. What all of us understand is that the cities and towns of the state of Vermont are intimately linked to the future of the state. And if the legislature doesn't act boldly and decisively, we all suffer. I'll just give you an example. This year, the cities and towns of Vermont will be losing $13 million in revenue sharing. That is money that used to come from the federal government directly to the cities and towns to be used in any way that the cities and towns chose to use it. Burlington, like many communities, used it for police and fire protection. Other communities used it for capital improvements. Without that money, there is no question, and I think there's no disagreement amongst the cities and towns about this, that either property taxes will have to go up to fund the gap, or else services will be lowered. It is astonishing to me that the legislature and the governor have not begun any discussion at all about replacing revenue sharing. Basically, the cities and towns are on their own. They will either have to raise property taxes or cut services, and that's that. And that really gets to a pivotal issue, the most important issue that I think the legislature has to deal with, and that is the relationship of local government to state government. And in my view, in this state, it is an extremely unfair relationship. The state government has all the power. The state government has a dozen broad-based areas of taxation by which they can raise revenue. Cities and city governments, local governments have almost no power at all, with the exception of Burlington, which in the last few years has developed some alternatives to the property tax. We're basically dependent upon the property tax. So as I go down to Montpelier to raise the issues, that is in the back of my mind. How do we change that relationship? How do we make the legislature and the governor understand that they're not there just to represent quote-unquote state government, but that the cities and towns and the property taxpayers of Vermont are also part of the state of Vermont?
What's the first thing you're going to do?
Well, I think the first issue that has to be dealt with, the $64 question, is the issue of tax reform. I can sit here enumerating the many problems that face the people of the state of Vermont, and the legislature will say, yep, that's right, but then they'll conclude by saying, you're right, but there's nothing that we can do because we have no money to address those problems. So before we can begin to talk about the housing crisis, or the crisis in daycare, or the crisis in housing, or any of the other serious problems that we face, somebody is going to have to come forward and propose legislation based around progressive taxation. And by progressive taxation, what I mean is a tax program which asks those individuals and institutions who can best afford to pay taxes to start paying their fair share, rather than placing the tax burden on working people, elderly people, or poor people, which is what we do in this country and in this state to a large degree. And unless the legislature is prepared to deal with that, what you're going to see is either higher taxes for people who can't afford to pay it, or no funding for desperately needed programs. Do you understand what I mean? And unless they deal with that, a lot of what goes on in the legislature is really academic, because they're not going to have the resources to address the real problems. So I think the first issue is tax reform, and by that, what I mean is an understanding that since President Reagan has been in the White House, and because of the fact that Vermont's tax system is coupled to the federal system, the wealthiest people and the corporations in the state of Vermont have been paying significantly less in taxes, while property taxes for working people and elderly people have been soaring. That is the basic dilemma in Vermont. Property taxes have been going up, and yet income taxes for the wealthiest people in the state and for corporations has been going down. That's the basic tax reality. That has got to be dealt with by the legislature. If they choose not to deal with it, I see nothing significant coming out of this legislative session.
Just a question, how do you work with the senators and representatives from Chittenden County?
Well, actually, during the last week, we have met with both the Burlington representatives. We had 6 people to a meeting, some of the others couldn't come, and we met with 4 of the 6 members of the state senate. So we meet with them on a regular basis, talking about Burlington's needs, as well as some of the other problems that are facing all of the cities and towns, including Burlington. So we have a pretty good working relationship. But I'm still not convinced that on the statewide level there is that leadership to say, listen, we've got to get moving on A, B, C, and D. Let me give you an example. Property taxes. Now, once again, this is what the game, if you like, in quotes, is. The state has a dozen broad-based taxes. They have the income tax, they have the rooms and meals tax, the sales tax, the gas tax. You name it, the state has it. The cities and towns have one tax, basically, with the exception of Burlington. They have the property tax. Last year, property taxes in the state of Vermont went up by about $28 million. That is a lot of money, okay? It is amazing how little that issue, that reality, is discussed in Montpelier. They're really not all that concerned about it. Now, what's going on this year, in terms of course, this leads us right into the whole issue of education, which is where most of the property taxes go, statewide. What the legislature is proposing, no, I shouldn't say that. The governor and the legislature put together a commission on state aid to education and property taxes. And it's made up of, I believe, 13 people. Representative Obachowski of Brattleboro chairs it. And their task was to come up with a new formula to replace the Morse-Giuliani state aid to education formula. Now, in the state of Vermont, sadly, we are far behind the rest of the country in terms of state aid to education. Nationally, about 50% of the money for education comes from the state and less from the property taxes. In Vermont, we're about 2/3 from property taxes, only 1/3 from the state. So obviously, we were delighted to see the formation of this commission to deal with this very important subject. What we are hearing coming out of the commission is just, to me, absolutely incredible. The Morse-Giuliani state aid formula will sunset this year, so they've got to come up with something new, or else keep that going. The proposal that came out of the commission that was, quote-unquote, presented, they didn't really strongly support it, was a concept called the Foundation's proposal. And I cannot say to the people of Burlington strongly enough that if the Foundation's proposal is passed by the legislature and approved by the governor, in my view, it will be the single most deleterious act performed upon Burlington and many other communities in recent history. I think I can go so far as to say that it will probably destroy public education in Burlington. What essentially this commission has decided upon, or has recommended, is they now know who the rich communities are in the state of Vermont, who the wealthy communities are, and to all of those of us who live in Burlington, I have very, very good news for you. This commission has decided, I know you're all going to be delighted to hear this, that we are a wealthy community. So for those of you who are elderly, those of you who are having a hard time paying your taxes now, those of you who are barely hanging in, relax. The Vermont Commission on Property Tax Reform, or whatever it's called, has decided that you are wealthy. And what I am prepared to do, and in fact we'll make this statement publicly, is to invite some of these commissioners who are of the opinion that Burlington is a wealthy community, and we're going to take them around to many of our neighbors here to see just about how wealthy we are. If the Foundation proposal goes through, what it will mean is that a number of the so-called wealthy communities, Essex Junction, South Burlington, a number of others, will be forced to pay, by the state, not the city, higher property taxes, okay? And those additional property taxes will not go into the education of our own kids, but will go into the state pot and be distributed to other school districts around the state of Vermont. That means the people now who have seen the devastating impact of reappraisal, okay, who are having a hard time paying their property taxes now, who understand that today Burlington gets 1/20th per child in terms of state aid to education compared to other communities, the situation will become radically worse. Now what that will mean is that when property taxes are forced to go up in Burlington, to go to the state coffers, there is no way in God's earth that the local school board will be able to raise property taxes for its own kids, for our own kids. No way. So what you're going to see is the radical decline, in my view, of public education in Burlington. This proposal is so absurd, it has so many flaws that I could talk about that for hours. But what I would like to do is urge the people of Burlington now to write to Governor Cunin, to write to the members of the legislature, saying that it is absolutely unacceptable to consider a program by which property taxes in Burlington would be forced to raise, both commercial, industrial, and residential, and sent to Montpelier, with not a penny of it coming to our own kids. This would be a disaster. And we in city government, obviously, and the school board intend to do everything that we can to stop it. It would be an absolute disaster. But this is where the legislature is coming from. Rather than having the guts to talk about wealthy individuals, wealthy corporations who are making a lot of money, no. What they're talking about is some nebulous entity called a wealthy town, okay? There is no such thing as, quote-unquote, a wealthy town. There are towns that have a lot of wealthy people. That's fine. Tax those people. You know, if somebody has a lot of money and it can afford to pay higher taxes, I believe that person should be taxed. But if people do not, and God knows that in Burlington there are many people who are just hanging in there, cannot afford higher taxes, they should not be taxed. But the legislature apparently, at this point at least, does not have the courage to say, look, your income is going up, you're paying less in state income taxes than you paid 5 years ago, we want you to pay more. They don't have the courage to say that. Rather, they're going to say, everybody in Burlington, everybody in South Burlington, everybody in Essex Junction is wealthy. We're all wealthy. Absolutely, I mean, it's an absurd proposition. So, I mean, what we have got to do then is defeat the foundation's proposal very firmly, and then decide, you know, work to come up with some decent state aid to education formula.
I know that they're having a very difficult time coming up with some kind of consensus about state aid. Do you have any ideas about how to solve that?
I mean, we do. I mean, I ran for governor on a program which I think was eminently sensible. Basically, we do need more state aid to education. That is absolutely true. And what you need to do, basically, is increase income taxes for those individuals and corporations who can afford to pay it. That is the upper income people. Those people are paying less today than they paid 5 years ago. That's where you should move. You take that money, you put it into the state pot, and then you develop a fair distribution formula. And in my mind, a fair distribution formula would not allow a 20-to-1 discrepancy to exist. I think all of the communities, Burlington is not at war with rural communities or poorer communities who also need state aid. We know that they need more state aid, so do we. And the money should come from individuals and institutions who can afford to pay. So, you know, we have brought forth proposals and we'll continue to do that. Of the 3 proposals that are in the pot, probably a proposal that called the Baker-Grimes proposal, Barbara Grimes is of Burlington, it doesn't go as far as I would go, but because it has an income element into it, because the amount of money coming in is based on the ability to pay, makes more sense than some of the other proposals that we've been hearing.
Okay. So we took care of that issue.
Well, I wish we did. We've discussed that issue.
Is there anything else on
the
legislative agenda?
Very briefly, let me touch on just a couple of the other issues that I hope, very sincerely, will not be lost by the legislature and pushed into some committee not to be dealt with. The issue of utilities. You know, I talk a lot about that because in terms of dollars and cents, there are few issues that are more important. The telephone rates, the electric rates that people pay are very, very important. By and large, the legislature has absolved themselves of that discussion. They simply say, well, gee whiz, Public Service Board is going to take care of that problem. Well, unfortunately, that is not often the way that it is. And as we know, in the last number of years, the Public Service Board has been extremely pro-utility, anti-consumer, and has cost us literally tens of millions of dollars in higher than necessary telephone and electric rates. Now, the good news, the very good news in my view, is that Governor Cunin has decided not to reappoint Louise McCarran. And that's a good step, because in my view, Ms. McCarran was much too pro-utility and anti-consumer. Now, that's half the battle. The next half of the battle is to make certain that the chairperson for the Public Service Board that the governor appoints is pro-consumer. Very, very important decision. In my view, we can probably now talk about lowering of basic rates for telephone service in the state of Vermont. That's what we can talk about. And the electric situation is also by and large improved because of the declining cost of oil. We need an active public service board to demand that the private utilities and the public utilities do long-term planning. But clearly now the governor has the power to set the agenda for utility regulation for years to come by appointing a strong pro-consumer chairperson of the PSB, and I certainly hope that she will do that. Just a couple of other issues that I want to touch upon. In terms of social services, as a result of federal cuts, many of the poorest people in the state of Vermont are really going to be hurting. And we need the state to pick up the slack. Who else is going to do it? If the federal government turns its back on social services or on housing or on problems with the elderly, cities and towns can't do it. It's going to have to be the state. A couple of the areas that we're concerned about are daycare. The governor has made an appropriation or a suggestion of an appropriation. We would go a lot further. It is not, the truth of the matter is that a few $1 million can probably go a long way to solving the daycare problem in the state of Vermont, and that's desperately needed. Working mothers have the right to know that their kids are having good quality daycare at affordable rates, and I would place that very high on the agenda of priorities. Second of all, in terms of welfare reform, you have many welfare recipients who are receiving absolutely substandard checks for housing. I mean, if my memory is correct, I may be wrong on this, but I think I'm right. People are receiving checks to find housing in Chittenden County like for $150 a month, and everybody knows that you can't do that. So that's going to have to be adjusted upward. Another area of major concern is the issue of housing. Crisis in many areas of the state of Vermont. It's an expensive proposition. And I can go on and on about the many problems, whether it's high rents or lack of affordable new housing. Burlington has done, I think, an outstanding job in leading the state and coming up with approaches to attempt to deal with the housing crisis. The state legislature is going to have to be much more active there. But again, this is an area where the cities and towns can't do it alone. The federal government is turning away from low and moderate income housing. The state government is going to have to jump in. The last area that I want to touch on in terms of state priorities deals with workers' rights. And I think for a start, we've got to be talking about raising the minimum wage. And I would hope that it would be at least $4 an hour. And the second area deals with plant closing legislation. Last year, the governor did not support plant closing legislation. She has recently indicated that she might be more attuned to doing that this year after the closing of the Goodyear plant in Windsor and after the, just here in Semicon in South Burlington. Workers are entitled to more than having an employer coming in on a Friday and saying, guess what, you've worked here for 5 years or 20 years or 2 years, don't bother to come to work on Monday. Workers, as human beings, are entitled to more than that. So we would hope that some plant closing legislation will be passed. Those are some, just a few of the issues. I didn't even get into agriculture, which is obviously of major concern. But those are some of the statewide issues that I think the legislature is going to have to address.
Do you have a strategy for dealing with these issues?
Ultimately, it's not a very complicated strategy. The strategy is to rally public opinion. The legislature will do as little as it can do. That's the iron law of these things. If you have many, many thousands of people saying, for example, that we want tax reform because we don't want property taxes to go up, the legislature will respond. If the people sit back and go to sleep, then what the legislature will do is give tax breaks to wealthier individuals and come up with higher property taxes. So essentially, the strategy calls for mobilizing people to the greatest degree that we can. Let me switch now from the state. And the reason that I spend so much time on the state is that all of these issues are of extraordinary importance to the people of Burlington as well as to every other city and town in the state. We are not an island. There are so many areas that we simply don't have the power to move on that we need an active state legislature. So Burlington will, as we have in the past, play a very active role in the legislative discussion this year. But let me jump into some of the local issues that are of a great concern. And one of them, of course, is the waterfront. I'm happy to say that I think, at least, we are making some significant progress in terms of creating a people-oriented waterfront that will invite all of our people down to that beautiful resource and allow us all to enjoy it. It never ceases to amaze me as I go around knocking on doors and talking to people how excited people are about the possibility of utilizing that waterfront. And of course, we are making a lot of progress. The progress that we're making so far consists of the bicycle path, which people are just very, very excited about. They really enjoy that, and that's great. In terms of the bicycle path, my hope is that within the month, we can have the Parks Department plow the bicycle path in order to improve it for cross-country skiing. So we can use it as a cross-country skiing route, as well as the bicycle path in the summertime. Further, there is some discussion, Alderman Geer from Ward 4 made a very good recommendation, I think, about the possibility of lighting the bicycle path, which will enable us to have not only nighttime cross-country skiing, but nighttime bicycle riding as well, up to a reasonable hour. So that's something that we're contemplating. The bike path is a real significant new asset for recreational opportunities here in Burlington. Second of all, of course, Perkins Pier Park has been significantly expanded, and people are enjoying that. Now this week, we received, rather remarkably, I must say, a wonderful Christmas gift from our good friends at the Mobil Oil Corporation. Now some people think that Mobil Oil is not a nice corporation. They think it's a giant corporation that has been ripping off people for many, many years. Well, be that as it may, we feel, we're delighted, we really are. The gentleman that we spoke to at Mobil couldn't have been nicer. And what happened, as best as I could see, is we needed permission to go through the Mobil Beach. Now everybody, I think, knows where the Mobil Beach is. And that is, it's a little bit north, it's adjoining Oak Ledge Park. It's immediately north of Oak Ledge Park. And it's a beautiful beach, which really does not need a whole lot of work. People are already swimming on it. In any case, a while ago, I don't remember exactly when, the CEDO office, the Economic Development Office, asked the people in Mobil for permission to go through their property for the bicycle path. And they were very nice about it, and they said, no problem, you can do it. And I think that some of the people there saw how lovely the bicycle path was, and I cannot tell you more. You know, there may be tax breaks for them, and you know, that's their business and that's fine, but I think that got them thinking about their relationship to the city, and lo and behold, they surprised us all by saying, yeah, we contemplate giving the entire 8 acres. There are 7.8 acres of land. Hard to estimate exactly what it is, probably a little bit less than $2 million worth of property, but it's beautiful waterfront property which will be deeded to the people of the city of Burlington in perpetuity, so it's ours. And that is another step forward in opening up the waterfront to the people. That will be, in all probability, converted into a beach, and it's in fact a nicer area in many respects than the Oak Ledge swimming area right now. A lot of people enjoy, as I do, jumping off the rocks in Oak Ledge. That's great, but now you're going to have really a wide, flat beach area, which should make for some great swimming in the south end of the city. Now, the other waterfront program that we're looking at right now, and this excites me immensely because I think this will be really great if we can pull it off, would be a bond issue of between $2 to $3 million, which would do a number of things. Number one, it would widen the bicycle path at certain areas and also extend the bicycle path. So some of the money goes to the bicycle path. Other parts of the bond issue would go to the construction of a community boathouse south of Perkins Pier Park. Okay? And the community boathouse, of which more details have got to be worked out, would essentially be a place where in the summertime people can come down and rent paddle boats or canoes or sailboats or rowboats just for a few bucks and take them out and enjoy it. In the wintertime, it could be a place where people could do ice skating or ice fishing or whatever. Basically, it's just another magnet to draw people down of all income levels who can enjoy that area. Furthermore, there will be the opening up of more beach space around that area. And in addition to that, although the money would not be coming out of this bond issue, we would be addressing the pollution problem that exists in that area. Right now, we have two problems. The effluent that comes from the wastewater plants is not as clean as it should be. And as I'm sure the people of Burlington will remember, a couple of years ago we passed a $23 million bond issue. Well, we want to put some of that money to clean up that area right now. Also, in the coming years, our hope is that we can have a publicly owned marina in that area. So we are making some real progress. In addition, the bond issue would include another boat access area near the Moran plant, and some more improvements of city-owned property down on the waterfront. So it's a continued effort to improve what the city owns and bring people down to enjoy the precious resource that is Lake Champlain. So we're pretty excited about that, and we think we're making some real progress.
Are there any, those are public initiatives, are there
Yes.
any private initiatives?
No, I think right now the private initiatives are a little bit, as they say, on the back burner. We are involved in a legal suit against the railroad and the Alden Corporation regarding the public trust auction. And I don't want to go into all of the details of that, other than to say that we are arguing that land that at one point belonged to the people of the state of Vermont has got to be used in a public way. And there are differences between us and the railroad and Alden. The differences between us and the railroad are much stronger than they are between us and Alden, as a matter of fact. But we are in court, and ultimately the court is going to have to give us a decision, because until we have a decision regarding public trust of the waterfront, the filled areas, the property rights of the owners of that property are always going to be in question, as they are today. So I would say that while that is being discussed, the private development is on the back burner a little bit. But the other exciting, I think, and positive development is that last Monday night, the Board of Aldermen, with one exception, it was I believe, only one alderman voted against it, approved new zoning for the waterfront. And again, without going into a whole detailed discussion, everybody acknowledges, or almost everybody, that this new zoning significantly protects significantly more than before against undesirable development on the waterfront. It gives far more access to the waterfront than we've ever had before. It will limit the heights of buildings. It will determine what kind of development in certain areas is acceptable and what kind is not. So I think the three political factions worked very well on that. That was a very good example of nonpartisan movement, and I was delighted by that. But to the listeners out there, the viewers, I would say that I think we are making some significant progress in protecting the waterfront and in opening it up to people of all income levels. So
we've got about 4 more minutes, and for you to touch on
4 minutes. I've just begun here. What is
anything you want to touch on?
Okay.
What's going on with cable television?
Cable television. Well, what more appropriate time than being on cable television to talk about cable television? Essentially, we were very disappointed by Green Mountain Cable's suggestion that the people of Burlington should be paying a 19% increase in their cable TV rates. We attempted to negotiate something that was not successful. We're now in court. Without, again, going into a very long story, essentially what's happening is that throughout the United States of America, as a result of our friend the President and the Congress, cable television is now deregulated. That means that all over America, cable companies have the right to charge anything they want. They want to double your rates, triple your rates. There is no legal protection that citizens have. That's the reality. Now, we understood this a while back when we negotiated our agreement with Mountain Cable, and as you recall, we got a monetary sum from Mountain Cable in order to, in a sense, buy out the city's rights from ourselves as a city, becoming a municipally owned cable company. But more than that, we put some very strong language into that contract to protect Burlington ratepayers. And I have to say that Burlington is the only community in the state that has any protection right now, and in fact, probably one of the very few communities in the United States of America. To make a very long story short, it is our view that Mountain Cable is not entitled to any rate increase this year, zero, and that next year they're going to have to come back and justify why they need a rate increase. We are in court. We went to court on Tuesday. I think the judge should be making a decision within a little while.
And so the decision basically is, do the rights of Burlington subscribers, as you've negotiated, supersede any federal regulation?
Well, the judge himself, in his brilliant wisdom, decided to throw that element in. The real issue that we went in there, and I think the cable company went in there, was to debate the language in the agreement. And the agreement was essentially to interpret language as to whether or not the company could come in for a rate increase this year, or whether they had to wait another year to come in. That's really all that we asked. Now, the judge has thrown something else in, which says, is Burlington preempting the federal decision to deregulate? Are we really substituting for the federal government? That, to me, is just absolutely absurd. We willingly signed a contract with a cable company. Everybody knew what was happening. But we will see what happens on that.
Okay. I have a lot of questions about that, but we can wait for another cable program.
Okay.
So do you have any other issues?
We are also going to be passing a resolution this Monday night, which will inform President Reagan of the vote that the people of Burlington took regarding his war against Nicaragua. And I think as this merry tale of the Iran-Nicaragua tale unfolds, I think and I hope that people will understand the correctness of the position that the city of Burlington has had for the last 5 years. about the immorality of that war, about the insanity of spending tremendous sums of money trying to destroy the people of Nicaragua, while at the same time we're cutting back on programs, in revenue-sharing programs for the sick and the elderly here in the United States. And my hope is that out of all of this mess in Washington, the one good thing may come out of it is that the illegality and the immorality of that war, a war which is being condemned all over America, will rise to the surface even more than it has in the past, and will leave the people of Nicaragua alone to live out their lives.
That's a good note to conclude on. Thank you. That was a lot. But I'm sure it's just a small part of what you do every day.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. This has been Lauren-Glenn Davitian with Meet the Mayor.